There's a knock at the prison cell. Joseph, Joseph, quickly, Pharaoh wants to see you. Then it came to pass, at the end of 2 full years, that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. What was he doing at the Nile? Can you recall another Pharaoh who also stood on the banks of the Nile? Moses III. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadows. This is more or less what Pharaoh saw at the Nile. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamt a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then, behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. The east wind is extremely hot, blowing from the Arabian desert, withers the crops and scourges the land. The Arabs differentiate between 2 kinds of east winds. The Kamsin blows about 50 days in spring, and the Samum that blows irregularly. The mention of the east wind means bad news for the king. Samum blows usually only for a short time, sometimes only for a few hours. It has the characteristics of a severe storm and can be very destructive in its effects upon men, animals, and plants. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. Although 2 dreams are mentioned, they speak only of one event. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. The word magician, kartumim, is derived from the Egyptian word meaning to pronounce a magic spell, and designating the priests as the masters of magic. They occupied themselves with the sacred arts of sciences of the Egyptians. Poor Joseph, he was exposed every day of his life to this evil curriculum. Hieroglyphic writings, astronomy, astrology, interpreting dream, foretelling, and magic. They were the guardians of the occult arts. And poor Joseph was exposed to this rubbish. The Nile, as well as the fat cows that ascended, was regarded by the Egyptians as the source of all life and fertility. The wise men were puzzled as to the meaning of the 2 dreams. They could think of no interpretation that would be likely to satisfy the king. What was God doing in this crisis, in this terrible crisis hour, that would release his faithful servant from prison? By the way, God is working for us, not against us. The devil works against us. Please, Joseph, don't despair. Your life in prison is almost over, my brother. God is working in mysterious ways, his wonders and salvation to display. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, that's Potiphar, both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamt according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. I think the butler was so embarrassed because he forgot about Joseph, that he praised him as high as heaven. Do you think Pharaoh would condescend to intervene and interview someone in prison? This would be a miracle. But listen what Moses wrote in Genesis. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. Can you believe it? King calling a jailbird. And they brought him quickly out of the dungeon and shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. Man, he looked so good. Ancient murals with bearded Asians from Beni Hassan. I love this research. Here you've got Egyptians with clean faces. The Egyptian story of Sinihu provides an interesting parallel to the episode in the life of Joseph. In this story, a courtier who lived some 300 years before Joseph's time tells of his return to the court of Pharaoh after a long period of exile in Canaan. He says, I was shaved and my hair was combed. I was clad in fine linen and anointed with choice oil. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. What did Joseph tell the embarrassed Pharaoh? So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. I love this. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. What do you read in this careful reply of Joseph? He transfers the focus from himself to his monotheistic belief in one God. He was very brave doing this. Verse 16, God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Joseph had lived a long time in Egypt and had associated long enough with high officials in the dungeon and in Potiphar's house to know well the customary formula of speech to be used in the presence of the king. Court custom required that the dreams of the king be given a favorable meaning. And Joseph is following this protocol. Joseph had lived long in Egypt and had associated long enough with high officials to know well the customary formula of speech to be used in the presence of the king. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. With these words, Pharaoh feels at peace. Joseph speaks like a very learned man. Where did he pick it up? We learn lessons in the traumatic experiences of life. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. The two dreams are related, essentially the same as verses 1 to 7. However, Moses avoids monotony by adding a few words in one place and using synonyms of the others. So we've got two accounts, and I'm going to read the second one as Joseph told it. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I've never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. When they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. So I awoke. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full of good. Then behold, 7 heads, withered, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears, and I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Joseph declared first of all that the 2 dreams had the same meaning, and pointed to their author, God, who thereby sought to warn Pharaoh and his subjects of events to come. The number 7, which played a prominent role in the dreams, pointed to 2 periods of 7 years each. Look at the picture here. I like the artists, man. Look at them. They've got very moods, but man, their artistic depictions, I love that. The fat cows and the full ears represented 7 abundant harvests, and lean ones 7 barren years. The latter would follow the former over the whole of the land of Egypt. So the years of famine would leave no trace of the 7 fruitful years. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come through all the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise. This is the bad news. And all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. What practical advice did Joseph give? And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Joseph also advised that during the 7 years of superabundance, a 5th part of the harvest should be levied as a tax and stored up throughout the country. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. What is the possibility that Joseph could become one of the junior officials on an advisory position? That only a 5th of the harvest should be collected each year implies that even in the lean years, the land was to produce something. The fertility of Egypt has always been dependent upon the yearly inundation of the land by the Nile, since rain is practically unknown. The fertility of Egypt has always been dependent, as I've said, upon the yearly inundation of the land by the Nile, since rain is practically unknown. Up and down. Before the construction of this Aswan Dam, dikes were built to control the normal rise of the river. If the flow of the waters was too high, much damage was caused to towns and people. When the flow of the river was too low, as I've said, it caused drought. Of the inundation of the Nile, Pliny wrote, "The ordinary height of 16 cubits, when the waters are lower, they do not overflow the whole ground. When higher, it takes a long time for them to recede." In the first case, the ground is not saturated. In the second, the waters are detained so long on the ground that seed time is lost. At a height of only 12 cubits, a famine is the consequence. Even at 13 cubits, hunger prevails. 14 cubits produces general rejoicing. 15, perfect security. And 16, all the luxuries of life. Let's continue listening to Joseph's brilliant advice. Did the Lord give it to him, or was this simple logic? I think we should use both. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. That the food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during famine. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" While he looked at Joseph, he noticed he was different. He saw the Spirit of God in him. You know, this is what I like to be. What about you? Joseph greets the Pharaoh and goes back to the prison. For the first time, he got out of the lockup of 3 years. What was Joseph thinking when he left the palace and went back to his dark and dismal cell? Will they accept his advice? Poor Joseph. Would God deliver Egypt from the coming famine? These thoughts ran through his mind. But what about his father and his brothers? Will they perish? In the meantime, an emergency cabinet meeting was called. The minutes read as follows. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you." And now for the greatest climax in the life of Joseph. Oh, I love the story. "Joseph, you shall be over my house." Can you see the expression on the face of Joseph? "And all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." Watch his face. What? Rule Egypt. What? I think when Jesus comes, we'll be sitting on thrones. God has got marvelous things ahead of us. The Hebrew expression "be ruled," thus translated, was long given various strange explanations by commentators, until the suggestion was made that an Egyptian expression might form the basis of the text. I love this research. If so, the statement would read literally, "According to your word or mouth, all my people shall kiss." It is as if Joseph gave kisses to all of them. In colloquial Egyptian, however, the phrase "to kiss" also means to eat. You know, when I was young and my young wife kissed me, it was like eating homemade bread. Moses' first readers, all of whom grew up in Egypt, would certainly have understood what was meant. This is additional evidence that Moses, a man educated in Egypt, wrote the book of Genesis. Please look at my series on the Exodus. beautiful gems are found in the story of Moses. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I've set you over all the land of Egypt." I wonder if he fainted. Can you see the surprise, the unbelievable surprise on his face? Tears of gratitude roll over his face. He graduates from a prison to a royal ruler of Egypt. Unbelievable. This is going to happen to us when Jesus comes. Somewhere here at our Father's, he falls on his knees and pray. Next time, we will continue the story of Joseph, the ancient Redeemer. My dear fellow prisoner, in the jail of pain, guilt, rejection, did you know that God has another kind of royal dream for us? A dream that will come true soon. From our position now to his palace soon. We are going to exchange our prison clothes of mortality for God's immortal royal clothes of sinlessness that's too good to be true. Father in heaven, help us to be a Joseph, faithful, kind and considerate. And thank you that his story is our story. As he was lifted from the dungeon to the throne, you are going to lift us from our dungeon of misery onto the thrones of your eternal heavenly history. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.